Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on Deconstructing Apartheid and Attacks Against Israel, featuring NGO Monitor's Anne Herzberg and co-sponsored by the Endowment for Middle East Truth and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. My name is Laurie Regan, and I'm Emmett's New York Chapter President and SPME's Vice President and Treasurer, and I'm delighted to moderate this afternoon's program, which is both critically important and timely, given the recent barrage of investigations and accusations accusing Israel of committing crimes against humanity in the form of apartheid against its Arab citizens. In particular, as many of you may have read, Amnesty International, a non-governmental organization that hides under the guise of human rights protection while focusing much of its resources on bashing the one and only Jewish state in the world, has issued a report that basically repackages the old UN anti-Semitic libel that Zionism is racism, labeling Israel an apartheid state while distorting international law, Israeli policy, and actual facts, and denying Jewish Israelis their right to self-determination. The Wall Street Journal described Amnesty's report as, quote, a denunciation of the very existence of Israel as a refuge for the Jewish people. And in light of Palestinian and NGO campaigns against Israel in the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and the UN Human Rights Council's establishment of a permanent commission of inquiry, which was discussed on a previous Emmett webinar, Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid warned about intense campaigns stating, we think that in the coming year, there will be debate that is unprecedented in its venom and in its radioactivity around the words, quote, Israel as an apartheid state. In 2022, it will be a tangible threat. We have a lot to cover, so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep my introduction brief, but I urge you all to learn more about both Emmett and SPME by visiting our respective websites at www.emmettonline.org and www.spme.org, and consider making a financial donation, as your support is critically important in allowing us to continue to conduct our work, including holding these weekly seminars. It's my pleasure to introduce today's expert, Anne Herzberg, who is the legal advisor of NGO Monitor. She is a graduate of Oberlin College and Columbia University Law School. Prior to joining NGO Monitor, she worked as an attorney in New York, where her areas of research included business and human rights, international human rights law, the laws of armed conflict, universal jurisdiction, international fact-finding, NGOs, and the UN. Anne is the author of the widely cited NGO Lawfare, Exploitation of Courts in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, co-author of Best Practices for Human Rights and Humanitarian NGO Fact-Finding, co-editor of the Goldstone Report, Reconsidered, and most recently co-author of the NGO Monitor Report, False Knowledge as Power, Deconstructing Definitions of Apartheid that Delegitimize the Jewish State. Anne's articles and op-eds have also appeared in many publications, including the American Journal of International Law, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, YNET, and the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Anne, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Laurie. It's a pleasure, and thanks to Emmett and SPME also.
It's great to have you here. We have a lot to cover. So yeah. I want to start by asking if you can spend a few minutes on what exactly apartheid is and whether or not there is an accepted legal definition of apartheid that can be used against Israel on the international stage, whether at the UN, the ICC, or elsewhere. In light of the recent Amnesty Report, which concluded that Israel was committing crimes against humanity in the form of apartheid since its founding in 1948, and which follows on the heels of reports released by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch last year, all three organizations of which are anti-Israel NGOs, on what basis do these various groups and UN councils have for calling for legal action against Israel? And for those who are interested in a more in-depth analysis of the history of apartheid and its evolution, I'm going to put the link to Anne's recent article or essay up on the chat so you all can access it there.
Great. So yeah, there's a lot in that question we have to unpack. So let's start. What is apartheid? What is that phrase? So it's a legal term, and it relates to the regime that governed South Africa from the practices of apartheid started prior to this, but the regime legally started in the 1940s and ended in the early 1990s. And we were all familiar with the images on TV, Nelson Mandela getting out of jail. Apartheid was an institutionalized regime of separation where every facet of life in South Africa was basically determined by race. So where you went to school, who you could marry, where you could work, what hospital you would attend, where you could sit, where you could live, cradle to grave, every aspect of your life was dominated by this legal regime. Now, apartheid, as we all know, and we probably, maybe some of us were anti-apartheid activists in the 80s. That was very popular, particularly on college campuses. It was routinely condemned by the international community. And as a result, the prohibition of the practice of apartheid was included in several international treaties. But surprisingly, there is no one legal definition of apartheid. And when apartheid, the legal term apartheid is used, people are actually really referring to probably 3, maybe 4 different what they would determine to be crimes or prohibitions. So you have a state prohibition against apartheid, where states cannot engage in apartheid. You have a war crime of apartheid that's found in the Geneva Conventions. And then you also have the crimes against humanity of apartheid, which covers individual, it's an international crime covering individual action and barring them from apartheid. Now, turning to the UN and the International Criminal Court, part of the issue and why what makes this issue so difficult to challenge, unfortunately, is because, as I said, there's no one definition. And actually, in a couple of the treaties where they mention apartheid, no definition at all is given. So no one really knows what it means to be apartheid. And because of this, NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have really tried to fill that vacuum and essentially invent a definition that applies to Israel alone. And so then enter in the ICC and the UN. And I should also just mention, when it comes to international law, a lot of people want certainty in international law, but there's no overarching body that defines international law. There's no international court explaining what international law means. And because these terms are very amorphous, the UN, for instance, and as Lori mentioned, they are going to be issuing probably 3 reports this year calling Israel the apartheid slur. They can pretty much make up whatever they want. And then that's really the problem. The ICC is governed by, the International Criminal Court is governed by what's known as the Rome Statute, which is their treaty. And there is a definition of apartheid as a crime against humanity in that treaty. But even when you look at the definition, the terms used are also very vague. It uses words like oppression and domination. Again, what do those words mean? It's surprisingly, very little has been written about it. And I'll just say that the report that I issued in December with my co-author, Barrister Josh Kern from the UK, is that we wanted to look at each of these elements and try to figure out, what do these terms even mean? And I believe we're actually the first people who have done that. The other thing is, at the UN and really at the ICC, there's very little oversight or accountability as to what they're doing. So the UN, for instance, as I mentioned, could basically say whatever it wants. And it's even more so when you're dealing with what are known as rapporteurs at the UN. So the UN appoints what they call independent experts. And they have one for the Palestinians, who's typically a BDS activist, anti-Israel demagogue. And that person can make up whatever he wants to say. And then it gets the UN stamp on it. And that gives his words a lot of credibility, even if he, is completely making something up or he doesn't even know what he's talking about. It doesn't really matter. With the ICC, they're a little bit, they're more professional. However, there's no democratic oversight. So if they completely overreach or apply definition that, seems completely out of keeping with practice, there's very little that countries can do about it. And unfortunately, in our case, Israel, when I say we, I mean Israel, is really become the victim now of severe overreaching at the ICC, because Israel is not a member of the ICC. It did not join the Rome Statute, so it's not bound by what the court does. However, in 2019, in a mass power grab, the former prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda from the Gambia, decided to apply to what is known as the pretrial chamber at the ICC, seeking authorization to open an investigation of Israel, even though Israel is not a member of the court and state of Palestine is not a state under international law. And a year ago, actually, this week, the pretrial chamber ruled in a highly controversial 2-1 decision that the court did have jurisdiction and that the prosecutor was authorized to open an investigation, which she did do in March. So unfortunately, Israel, we are now at the point where the ICC could take action against Israel. In June, they appointed a new prosecutor, Karim Khan. At the moment, it doesn't look like he's doing much on the Israel case, but he could perhaps. So again, it's a lot of unknowns. And really, this is what prompted these NGO reports, because as soon as ICC agreed to open this investigation, the NGOs put out these reports because that is their ultimate dream, that an Israeli gets indicted by the International Criminal Court. So that's what prompted this last wave of reports, even though this isn't a new charge. Now, also, I mean, nothing really stops NGOs from making these claims. That's the other thing. There's no standards really for NGOs, so they can pretty much levy any charge they want, regardless of how accurate it is. And unfortunately, these groups have a lot of influence at the UN, at the ICC, and and a lot of times, there's a kind of what I call a revolving door between the UN and these NGOs, where they move seamlessly in terms of career path between these two organizations. And so therefore, a lot of the reporting that comes out of the UN is really just a copy and paste of NGO reports. And so, that's something that unfortunately, I'm expecting that the reports that come out, the first ones coming out in March, will just be a copy and paste of these NGO reports, unfortunately.
It makes absolutely no sense. And that takes me to the next transition. The question is, in the context of the way in which apartheid is defined by those who seek to attack Israel, can you explain to the viewers the origins of the accusations of apartheid, specifically, in the context of Israel in particular? I mean, how is it even conceivable that a country in which Arabs own real property, serve in the Knesset, hold judicial positions, work as doctors, nurses, lawyers, and other professionals across the country can be considered to be committing apartheid against its Arab citizenry? And I'll just mention that in a recent poll, when asked the question, quote, if you could be granted citizenship in a Western country, would you prefer to live there or to remain in Israel? 81% of Israeli Arabs voted to remain in Israel. So how is there such a disconnect between the opinion of actual Israeli Arabs and outside NGOs and the UN who seek Israel's demise, really? That doesn't exactly scream apartheid to me.
Yeah, I mean, the trick, really, what these organizations are doing legally, and we get into that in our report, and I assume probably most people listening are not lawyers, so I don't want to get too mired in the legal weeds. But what they've been doing is they are trying to decouple the crime of apartheid from South Africa. So some of the instruments that talk about apartheid explicitly say you have to look at the practices of apartheid. And if one in South Africa, and if one does that, of course, this claim is completely ridiculous as applied to Israel. So what these NGOs have done, they basically invented a definition that then they can claim equals apartheid. But really, the way we have to look at this is, I mean, this to me, and I wrote this report on Lawfare back in 2008, and to me, this really is the original Lawfare, because when you look at the apartheid accusation, the specific accusation began in the 1950s, but really what it was a continuation of the rejectionist campaign of the Arab states and what was known as the Arab Higher Committee, which were the Arabs living in what is today Israel at the time. And they essentially were trying to, denigrate Zionism, do everything they could to prevent a Jewish state coming into existence. And when they failed militarily at that, when they were unable to block like the UN Commission, the UNSCOP Commission, and then the vote in 1947, that basically then they turned to try to use these legal terminology to denigrate Zionism. And so the charge, as I said, began in the 1950s, but it was helped because of the Cold War. So that was denigrating Zionism was a key feature of Soviet propaganda. And some of you probably read an article by Richard Kemp on this that was published a couple of weeks ago. And so that sort of disseminated the charge widely. And also at the time, we have to remember that the decolonization movement was very popular, and the Soviets had a very strong hand in that movement. And so there were these blocks of voting at the UN, the non-aligned movement, and then you had the Organization for African Unity, and they were ripe for the Soviet propaganda. And so they therefore also were heavily disseminating this apartheid claim. And the point of it was to equate Zionism to the great evils of the 20th century, Nazism, colonialism, and racism, and to basically portray Israel as anathema to the international legal order post-World War II. And the charge is very powerful because it's an easy way to essentialize and exploit anti-Semitic tropes, to essentially transform the conflict from one of disputed lands, an Arab rejectionism of a Jewish presence in the Middle East, to one of racism. And as we know today, that has a lot of purchase in the zeitgeist these days. And racism is really one of the worst accusations that one can be charged with. And South African apartheid was probably, was one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. And so therefore, it's a very, again, it's like, it's just a horrible accusation to level at a country. And another powerful aspect of the accusation is that it has a plan of action built into it, building off the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa. So, which is namely boycotts, international isolation of the country, and ultimately elimination, because that's what you do to an apartheid regime. You eliminate the regime. And so when you closely examine the NGO reports, their main attack is not really focusing on specific policies, but it focuses on what I deem as a 1948 agenda. So in other words, the practices and laws that really go to the heart of Israel's character as a Jewish state and as a refuge for the Jewish people. And what these groups are saying is that the only way to solve apartheid, in their view, is basically to eliminate the Jewish character of Israel and have it replaced with an Arab and Muslim state. And I will say also, just in the presentation I'm looking mainly now at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. Human Rights Watch was a bit more sophisticated in its presentation. So it was harder to parse it out from their reports, rather than an Amnesty's report, where it was very clear what was going on. But both reports did the same thing when you examine them. And so I'm glad, at least with the publication of the Amnesty Report, this is really getting out more in the media. I don't know if that's because Human Rights Watch is a bit more savvy media-wise, and they're an American organization. So they have a very strong PR department and a corporate culture that keeps them very on message, as opposed to Amnesty, which is the sort of European radical left Corbynite ethos. And also because it was the second report, so it didn't get as much media coverage. But I mean, so really, it was good that the Amnesty Report, like the anti-Semitism was so clear that, people were able to demonstrate that. But I will say the same thing was in the Human Rights Watch report. It was just that it didn't get as much attention from that aspect.
We had talked about this when we were just signing on to the webinar, that Eugene Kondorovich wrote a terrific opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal today that I urge everybody to take a look at, because he points out that if anybody's actually committing apartheid, it's the Arab population in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where Jews are not allowed to own property, and nor are they permitted to worship or live in those areas. So I urge everybody to take a look at that. And I also wanted to point out to everyone that if you missed 2 weeks ago, we hosted Colonel Richard Kemp, who you brought up, and on a webinar discussing the Soviet propaganda that led to, the beginning of this apartheid accusation in the 50s.
I just want to add that one of the forgotten history, of Israel's founding was, prior to the founding, what was also going on. The Arabs were campaigning and lobbying the British to cease all Jewish immigration. So it's so pernicious then that this charge gets turned against the Jews, where they didn't want any Jews coming in. The British were trying to limit it, 75,000, 50,000 Jews. The Arab states and the local Arabs were trying to block any Jews from coming in. And the British were basically enforcing these policies, preventing any land being sold to Jews. So it's quite rich that then they turned that immediately on its head and applied it against Israel. So it's important that people go back and remember that history.
And so for the audience watching, we just did put the link to the Wall Street Journal column and to our webinar 2 weeks ago with Richard Kemp in the chat, if anybody wants to take a look at those, as well as Anne's report and the NGO Monitor response to the Amnesty report. Lots of links in the chat. And I also I failed to mention at the beginning of the webinar that if anybody has any questions, you can please put them in the Q&A. Don't put them in the chat. And we'll get to some questions, your audience questions, a little later in the program. Anne, can you spend some time addressing the specifics of the Amnesty report and the inherent lies and other problems with that? In particular, can you explain why the report is anti-Semitic based on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and spend some time sharing the way in which the report whitewashes the Palestinian history of extreme violence and terrorism directed at the Israeli civilian population, not to mention their own Arab population?
Yeah, sure. So the report essentially combines both what are known as old and new anti-Semitic tropes. So the old tropes that are seen in the report is this, they really promote this, and a few people have written about this on Twitter, which I found is Isabella Taborowski, who's an expert on Soviet propaganda. She pointed this out, that they're really constructing this narrative of a grand Jewish conspiracy and of power. Other tropes that are coming out in this report are that everything that Israel does have these nefarious motives. So even, enacting policies to improve things for the Arab population, or engaging in peace negotiations or peace agreements, they're all portrayed by Amnesty as having this nefarious motive, all part of the plan to dominate the Palestinians and keep them down. And it was also reflected in an interview that Philip Luther, who's an Amnesty official, gave to the Times of Israel. And I really urge everyone to read this interview because it was astounding, the double standards that came out amongst the Amnesty officials. But in that interview, he noted, the UN never punishes Israel because of all the influence Israel wields at the UN with powerful states. So you see that conspiracy and Jewish power tropes coming through. But also what the report does, and this is where IHRA comes in, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, is that in the IHRA definition, they include some examples of what could be termed as the new anti-Semitism, where the state of Israel is standing in the place of the Jew. And it is, and I'll quote it, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And in 2021, the European Commission put out a guidebook that went into more detail about this definition. And I'll just, if you'll just indulge me, I'll read it because I think it's really important. It said, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination and a national homeland is anti-Semitic because it denies the religious and historic ties of Jews to the land of Israel. It evades the fact that the State of Israel was founded in 1948 based on Resolution 181 of the General Assembly, and moreover, asserting that a country is a racist endeavor by portraying ambivalent aspects of modern statehood in a demonizing manner exclusive to the State of Israel is an attempt to undermine the international legitimacy of the country. And that's very clear in the Amnesty Report. So policies that can be found in any country, Amnesty deems that in Israel's case as apartheid, which is ridiculous. For instance, certain immigration rules, and also Amnesty complete. And then you have the double standards where, a lot of practices, in the Muslim world, where there's separation between Muslims and non-Muslims. Amnesty never covers that kind of thing. So here they're taking things that are routine policies in other countries. No one bats an eye at it. But when Israel does it, suddenly it's apartheid. And then when there's real apartheid, such as what Eugene wrote in the Wall Street Journal, they completely ignore those policies. Now, turning to sort of the factual problems in the report, it would take me hours to go through them all because the lies and distorted claims, jump out on every page. But I'll just mention a few that really, jumped out at me when I was going through the report. One of the things was the way they portrayed army service, completely ignoring the fact that Bedouins serve in the army and that today increasing numbers of Israeli Arabs that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be joining the army want to join the army now. It ignored the issue of Haredi Jews that do not serve in the army, making it seem like Jews dominate the policies of the army and only Palestinians don't have the benefit of army service, when the same thing applies with the ultra-Orthodox Jews. They talk about laws where supposedly Israel passed laws aimed at banning Arab parties from participating in the political process, when the only case that I'm aware of where a party has actually been banned is actually the Kach party, which is a Jewish party. Online now, Amnesty every day has been posting these kind of propaganda videos promoting lies in their report. So they had one about how Israel is stealing water.
Sorry about that.
No worries. And then they basically ignored so they had this one line about the rockets on Jerusalem, but then they completely ignored the 4,000 rockets that followed that a few days later. The worst, I thought, was when they were describing the suicide bombings of the early 2000s. And they basically said, Palestinians placed explosive objects in crowded areas. That was their sole description of suicide bombings. And it was ridiculous. And then completely erasing the severity of a suicide bomb necessitated a lot of the policies that Israel had to enact. So they completely decoupled that, in order to paint this picture of Israeli venality. So I could go on and on with many more examples, but those were just some of the most egregious.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's very telling about the whole process, and that's why I wanted to just touch on some of them. So as if the report itself is not already troubling enough, the recommendations in the report would lead to really the end of the Jewish homeland. Can you address the way it lambasts Israel's law of return while recommending an Arab right of return, which would really, again, mean demographically the end of the Jewish state? And can you also touch on some of the other recommendations that are really dangerous to Israel's survival that Amnesty made in the report?
Yeah, for sure. So Amnesty tries to portray that and falsely so, that there is something wrong and illegitimate about Israel's law of return, which, as we all know, was enacted in the wake of the Holocaust in order to provide safe haven for Jews, and also Jews who were coming from Arab countries that have been kicked out following Israel's founding. But also, I mean, going back to the history of the founding of the state, the Balfour Declaration, the mandate for Palestine, that was the point, to allow Jewish immigration in order to build up the Jewish homeland. And so Amnesty is trying to portray this as something illegal and a violation of international law when it's grounded in international law. And they also ignore, that many countries, Greece, Germany, Ireland, South Korea, China, there's a whole host of countries that have similar policies where they have a special track for citizenship for their diaspora populations. And again, that doesn't mean that, once you've immigrated to Israel, I made Aliyah. I've been living in Israel almost 20 years. And I don't have, I have no, the fact that I'm a citizen, I don't have any different type of citizenship than, let's say, an Arab Israeli who was born in Israel. It's the same citizenship. It's just the track of how I obtained that citizenship, which is different. And that's very common in many countries around the world. And Amnesty is, portraying it as something evil. But also the other recommendations in the report are just, like crazy, really. I mean, you have, they call for an arms embargo against Israel. So essentially making it impossible for Israel to defend itself from terror attacks or from Hezbollah rockets, from Iran. They are calling for boycotts of Israel and businesses that people doing business with Israel. They shockingly call for the end of security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. So can you imagine like the increase in violence that would result from that? They have an attack on the Oslo framework, which right now is the framework that governs what's going on with the Palestinians. It was mutually agreed to and witnessed by the international community. And basically, painting that, as I mentioned, as this like nefarious agreement. And they also suggest in the recommendations that any peace agreement would be something that's illegitimate. And so therefore, the only agreement that would satisfy Amnesty's demands and that Amnesty would claim would meet international legal standards would be essentially the elimination of the country as a Jewish state. And I'll just throw in there that that's essentially also what Human Rights Watch was advocating.
So in light of all that, are you concerned that while the report seems to have been generally rejected by important international powers, including Germany, Austria, the UK, the Czech Republic, Australia, and then the US, with the US State Department specifically stating, and this is a quote, "The Jewish people must not be denied their right to self-determination, and we must ensure there isn't a double standard being applied." So are you concerned that the real danger with the report is that the UN Human Rights Council, which is inherently anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, and which the US had pulled out of under the Trump administration, but unfortunately Biden rejoined, that the UNHRC is going to utilize this report in its upcoming commission of inquiry? I mean, it seems to me, and you kind of touched on this, that Israel's in a no-win situation. They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. If they give gay rights to people, they're pinkwashing. If they seek peace for the Palestinians, it's nefarious. So the criticisms never end, and Israel's held to a standard unlike any other nation in the world, including tyrannical dictatorships, which actually do commit human rights violations and crimes against humanity. So can you also expand upon, sort of touch on that and the commission of inquiry, and also touch on the notion of lawfare and the way these NGO reports, I think you sort of said how the UN uses these reports.
Yeah, so what's going to happen is, I'll get to sort of the US government issue in a minute. So in March, the Human Rights Council is meeting in March. So the current rapporteur for the Palestinians, Michael Link, is going to be issuing a report calling Israel apartheid. So that's coming in March. And then you have the COI report that's coming out in probably late June, early July. And they no doubt will adopt this report from Michael Link. And they will also, and Michael Link's report no doubt will be copying verbatim almost. I'm just waiting for it. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. So you're going to have these two UN reports that are going to also then be copying each other. And then there's also, which I didn't mention earlier, there's a treaty body called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And in 2018, the Palestinians filed an interstate complaint against Israel. And it was the first time that procedure had ever been used in the history of the treaty. And the UN, surprisingly, the UN Office of Legal Counsel said that the treaty body did not have jurisdiction to hear this complaint, but the committee ignored that and decided to go ahead with the Palestinian complaint. So they're going to be impaneling a committee, and they have very radical people on that committee. And they also will likely, at the end of 2022, be calling Israel apartheid. And again, that committee will take what was already been said by Michael Link and by the COI. And the COI itself is going to issue two reports a year, once to the council, once to the GA, the General Assembly. So every year now, in perpetuity, we're going to be having these two reports calling Israel apartheid, plus it'll generate additional reports. And I think, you know, outside of, and then we'll see, I don't know what the ICC is going to do. No one can predict that. But I think what really bothers me in the UN context, I mean, you can't, because of the way the voting is and the domination by authoritarian regimes and the dictatorships and the Arab League bloc and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, you can't stop a vote at the UN. It's impossible. Like, they have an automatic majority all the time. But what bothers me is, so the Biden administration, you know, went back into the council, you know, debatable if that was a wise choice. But what's really crazy is, why are we giving them money?
Right.
You know, we're opposed to this council, we're opposed to the council, we're opposed to this commission, but we're giving them money, you know? So I think that's something, at least people listening right now who are in America, that's certainly something you can go to your Congress people about and demand that they do not allocate any funding for this. And similarly, the Europeans, which are far worse than the Americans, you know, the Europeans can't even vote no half the time. They'll abstain from a vote. And the same thing, though, they'll say in their statements to the council, they were opposed to the creation of this commission of inquiry. It's outrageously expensive, but yet they all voted to fund it, you know? So if you have any listeners out there from Europe, I highly advise them to start also speaking to their parliamentarians. It makes no sense to me how you can be completely opposed to something, you know, and then give it money. It makes no sense. It's completely absurd. And then I'll say, like, the more other pernicious effects of this report, I don't see it having a huge impact on Israel. I mean, there's the concept, you know, of a silent boycott where, you know, overtly the BDS campaign has not been successful. There've been very few open BDS activities, and you have the anti-boycott laws in America that have, you know, that is a way to get back when companies are boycotting. But the silent boycott is something we don't know if a company has decided not to engage in business because of these types of reports, you know, and that's the more kind of pernicious aspect of the boycott campaign, because you don't really know if that's why a particular decision was made or didn't happen, because it didn't happen. So you don't know. And then also, I think the impact is on the diaspora Jewish communities. So as we all know, unfortunately, you know, rise in anti-Semitism, attacks on Jews, and these types of reports are used to harass kids on college campuses, and I'm afraid will be used to undergird violence. So that's something I'm very afraid of. I'm not afraid of it, you know, harming Israel's existence at this point, even though it's so damaging. But that and also to create, and these groups openly say it, they want to create a wedge between Jews and the diaspora and Israel. And these reports are the way to do that. And it's, you know, unfortunately, they target people who are not educated and they package it very slickly so it appeals to people with a particular viewpoint. And that's where I feel like the damage really comes from these types of reports.
Yeah, I mean, you made me think of Whoopi Goldberg. I wonder if she read
Right.
it and her takeaway was.
Exactly.
I mean, the ignorance is just so pervasive, and that's what's out so frightening. You made some really good points there, Anne. And we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. Before I open it up to audience questions, I'm guessing that everybody wants to hear your opinion on what can be done to address claims that Israel is an apartheid state. And you did point out the funding of the UN, and in particular, pulling. I was so happy when Trump pulled out of the UNHRC, and then we went back in. One opinion in the Wall Street Journal stated that the only winning move is not to play. That was the quote in the op-ed. Do you agree, or do you believe that Jews the world over, and certainly anyone in America with moral fiber that supports Israel and understands its importance, not just to the Jewish people's survival, but also U.S. national security, should band together to fight these claims? And if so, how do we go about accomplishing that? Are there economic, lawfare, other tactics that can be used to shut down NGOs like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, UN inquiries that have basically predetermined, conclusions based on anti-Zionism, and others who seek Israel's demise?
Yeah, so, I think it's tricky. I think you have to fight the war. I think, unfortunately, you have to respond to the charges. You don't have to do it in the way that they lay it out, that Amnesty lays it out. You don't have to play their game. And I think we've shown that in the past couple of weeks. We're not gonna answer every little detail that they bring up. No, we're gonna show and prove that the overarching point of this report is to call for the elimination of Israel. And I think we've been successful in exposing that report. So I do think it is important to expose these reports. It has not helped, unfortunately. The state of Israel, up until recently, did not want to fight these types of reports and has said nothing, pretty much. And the problem with that is it cedes the space to these actors. And it leaves a vacuum. And as I was saying, especially in the legal realm where these definitions are so amorphous, you are essentially leaving HRW or Amnesty, you're telling them that they get to define what apartheid is, the crime of apartheid. No, we can't let them do that. We have to point out why that's wrong. We may not win, but you have to at least make a fight. And especially like in the UN, I'm our UN representative. So before COVID, I used to go to Geneva many times a year, and I do a lot of work now online at various UN meetings, and they hate that we're there. I could just ignore it and say the Israeli shmoom, who cares about the UN? But it drives them crazy that I'm there, interrupting their debates and pointing out all the things that they're saying that are false. And my reports get posted on the UN website alongside their reports. So again, even if it doesn't make it into the final report, the hope is, people studying this issue who are not brainwashed or totally anti-Israel will come to that website. And when they start clicking on the reports, they'll see our reports, and say, oh, wow, there is another viewpoint to what's going on here. And, and we're also exposing, the lack of methodology, the bias, the conflicts of interest, all the other corrupt things that are going on there. So I think it is important to point that out. Another thing that can be done, shutting down NGOs, I don't know if I agree with that per se, but it is important that many, especially of the Palestinian NGOs, but a lot of the international NGOs, are getting government funding for these campaigns, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars a year for these campaigns. And so it's very important to go to the various governments and tell them this is not what taxpayer funding should be used for, to get the money cut off. So I think that's very important and effective. And then the last thing I would say is I really see this as an opportunity for the Jewish community and also for just in general to really educate about the legal and historical foundations of Israel and Zionism. We should take this as an opportunity. That's really been kind of lacking in the past 30, 40 years. People, like a lot of kids don't really know the history, unaffiliated Jews, kids on college campuses. So I think that's somewhere where the Jewish community, especially in America, can step in and really use this as a springboard for a mass, effort at educating kids, on why Israel exists, its legality, its legitimacy, its morally, the moral foundations for the state. So those are some of the things I'd suggest.
Yeah, I mean, people focus on Holocaust education, but I think that, history in general is not being taught properly, certainly not the history of the region and the founding of Israel. So that is important. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A, and a lot of people have asked who funds Amnesty, HRW, and you did mention that there are governments that donate to them. And so can you go into a little bit more if we know where the funding comes from? Someone else asked if it's Soros. And then are the reports part of a linked strategy by common actors with specific strategic goals at the UN and other forums?
Yes. Okay. So in terms of the funding, so actually Amnesty and HRW, as opposed to groups like B'Tselem or the Palestinian NGO Al-Haq, they actually don't get a lot of government money that we know of. Although I will say on both organizations, they're completely non-transparent about their funding. And it's become less so since we started investigating their funding. So like Human Rights Watch used to publish all its donors on its website. It's very hard to find it now. And Amnesty is a complete black hole, knowing where their money is coming from. Now, Human Rights Watch, in 2009, the person writing the reports on Israel was exposed to be a closet Nazi fetishist. He had posted like 9,000 posts on Nazi memorabilia websites, and wrote a book on Nazi medals. So that happened. And then the founder of Human Rights Watch, Bob Bernstein, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times denouncing the organization he founded. So when that happened, HRW was experiencing severe financial crisis. But what happened? Soros Open Society Foundation stepped in and gave them $100 million over 10 years. So that really relieved the funding crisis at HRW. I don't know now. I was actually trying to look for it the other day, and I was unable to find out how much they're still getting from Open Society. But they do get a lot of money from large foundations. Amnesty, again, black hole, we don't know. Now, in terms of coordinated efforts, absolutely. So if you look in our report from December, we document a lot of this. But like, for instance, in 2013, two UN rapporteurs for the Palestinians, Richard Falk and John Dugard, you may have heard their names before, attended a conference at Birzeit University, and I believe it's in Ramallah. And there were many NGOs there also. And in the conference record, they detail at this conference, they were discussing whether they should employ an apartheid strategy as opposed to an occupation paradigm, because they felt like apartheid has a stronger power. And especially with like a lot of the discourse happening around racism, they could exploit that in terms of public opinion. And also in that meeting, they were discussing whether or not to go to the ICC and UN committees. And so that report was really a smoking gun showing how they were all working together. And since then, there have been many efforts, similar efforts like that. So it's clear they're all working together. In 2017, Richard Falk wrote a report for a UN agency, the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, calling Israel an apartheid state. It was such a horrible report that the Secretary General of the UN pulled it off the UN website, like within a few days of its publication. But Richard Falk went on to issue a follow-up report a year later, where he called on civil society to make this allegation against Israel, and basically gave them a blueprint how to do it. And lo and behold, a year later, we start seeing all these NGO reports coming out. So the trajectory is quite clear that it is a coordinated and well-funded effort, frankly, with European tax dollars for the most part.
Thanks, Anne. Our friend Richard Landis is watching and asked, this is a question from Richard, should we not also pick some of their more egregious abuse of evidence to illustrate their modus operandi? Is there a particular case that's a good example?
So I guess in terms of, I guess I'm not sure specifically what if he could type maybe in the Q&A, like what he means specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone else in the meantime, while we're waiting for more detail from Richard, what should Israel's response be?
So Israel, I do think they need to respond to it. Like I said, I don't think it's been helpful to just say nothing. But I think the probably most effective, but then I think the most effective thing the Israeli government can do is diplomatically, like in terms of, you know, when it comes to the UN, why are countries that are, let's say, opposed to the COI, for instance, or claim they're opposed to biased agenda item 7 at the UN, why do they then vote for the reports and vote for the resolutions adopting those reports? So I think that's where the Israeli government can come in, you know, and try to diplomatically convince those governments to not vote for these reports. Because even if we're going to lose the vote, it does send a strong message if every Western country rejects the report. You know, I think that has a very significant impact. So I think that's something they can do. Certainly, you know, in some of the cases of the NGOs that are involved in this campaign have massive ties to terrorist organizations that we've exposed on our website a lot, and several of them were designated by the Israeli government recently. So I think, you know, continuing to expose those ties, I think, can be very helpful also by the government.
Great, thank you. Someone asked, how about using the dominant definition of South African apartheid from the 1980s and insist on that, that to define apartheid as that? And also, what about apartheid slavery in the Arab world in Mauritania, Sudan, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in the report that we put out in December, we talk about that, how the definition has to be tied to South Africa, and I think that's reflected in the legal instruments. But again, you know, unfortunately, these bodies could do whatever they want, even if it's not legally, you know, I mean, what the ICC did in the case already involving Israel, claiming Palestine is a state such that they can join the ICC, was ridiculous, you know, and completely negating the Oslo Accords, which say the Palestinians have no criminal jurisdiction over Israelis that they could transfer to the ICC, but yet they allowed for it anyway. So unfortunately, that's the problem, that you have these courts that are, you know, just are not bound by anything, so that they can pretty much say what they want, unfortunately. So that's important to at least put out the alternative information. And I think definitely start exposing, you know, let's use these other cases and get them out there, and then hold HRW and Amnesty to the fire. Why don't you talk about this? You know, for sure.
Somebody had asked what groups besides HRW and Amnesty are in this, you know, or part of this campaign against Israel. And we had also mentioned that B'Tselem put out a report. So are there other groups besides those three? And then also, this is an interesting question. I leave it to you to try to answer, because my answer would be go on for hours. But can you explain the motives, funding, and strategy of B'Tselem? I am very confused as to why Jewish Israelis would participate in this organization.
So, yes. So B'Tselem. B'Tselem has undergone a change, which we have seen in recent years. It has a new executive director who has taken the organization in an increasingly radical direction. Also, the composition of their board has changed recently, in recent years, to also be much more radical. And he is the current executive director has openly said he doesn't care anymore about communicating to Israelis. Their whole modus operandi is influencing outside actors to put international pressure on Israel. So they don't care. Now, politically, I have no idea. I presume they want some sort of utopian binational state They don't, they kind of hide that. Like what is their desired political outcome that they want? They don't tell you. They do a very good job concealing that, so I don't know. They won't tell you. Now, I do think there is absolutely a role in Israeli society to have groups that are monitoring for human rights abuses and holding the government accountable. Absolutely, but B'Tselem has really always been a political group with originally their objective was what they would say is ending the occupation, whatever that means. I don't know, because that's another thing. It's occupation is kind of a weasel word because it could just apply to, what they call the West Bank and Gaza, but it could also apply to all of Israel. Like when Palestinian groups say occupation, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about 67 lines,
Right.
So, and B'Tselem used to say, I haven't looked recently, but they used to say their goal was to end the occupation. So everything they did has to be seen in that light to achieve this political objective. Like this human rights reporting was a means to achieve a certain political objective. Now, I don't know what that objective is because they don't really tell you, but because of, in their recent report using river to the sea rhetoric and Jewish supremacy rhetoric, which is just so offensive, and past statements in the past couple of years where they have just completely rejected the Israeli public. I just think they've gone off the rails. So, it's sad. They've lost it. Other groups are involved. A lot of there's Al-Haq, Palestinian NGOs, Al-Haq, there's Palestinian Center for Human Rights. There's a whole host of Palestinian NGOs. And then there's these international aid kind of NGOs, Diakonia from Sweden, FIDH in France. So there's this whole block of these European NGOs that are also heavily involved.
So Sarah Stern, Emmet's founder and president, has asked a question about something that it's possible that maybe Emmet could be working on. You had mentioned that some of the NGOs have massive ties to terrorist organizations. Can we work to take away the 501c3 status of these NGOs? And if you do have documentation that you could send to me and Sarah on this, that Sarah could be working on the Hill to make sure that they get stripped of their tax deductible status. But is that something you see as feasible?
I don't know of any that have 501c3 status, actually. Like they're all Palestinian NGOs. So they're not registered in the United States, as far as I know, as entities. But certainly, and truthfully, the U.S. government is good about not engaging with those groups because of the ties, the terror ties. So I would say on that front, it's more of an issue in Europe because these groups are allowed to have events in parliament. Although I will say some of these groups have been having in recent months events on Zoom and that kind of thing, so, that's troubling,
Yeah.
But it's more of a European problem, I would say, with these organizations than the United States. But certainly, if you see members of those organizations speaking on a university campus or doing events with the university or some other U.S. entity, I think for sure, they need to be alerted to that, and that that could be a potential violation of anti-terror laws.
Right. Why isn't more written or publicized about the nature and agendas of these NGOs? Most people are not knowledgeable about the history and are drawn to them because they promote it as peace, / justice promoting.
Yeah, I mean, we call it in our office the halo effect, because they're ostensibly talking about human rights and supposedly positive things for society. So people don't want to believe that they could also be engaging in these very harmful activities. And the other thing that's not well known is that these groups are an industry. So Amnesty's budget last year, I think, was something like $300 million. These are huge bigger than corporations. Human Rights Watch, I think, is around 100 million. So tons of money, thousands of employees, and it's not a regulated sector. So you have like corporations that have all of these requirements that they have to fulfill, and NGOs are not held to really similar standards because they, it's claimed that they have this nonprofit motive, but Ken Roth, the head of HRW, is making in excess. He's probably making close to $1 million a year, so I don't see that as being such a nonprofit type, salary. So I think these, I think these are the types of things. I mean, in our opinion, the more the better. Like the more people like looking into these kinds of issues, the better.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that Emmett, we try to do a lot of educating through these webinars, and there's a number of good organizations out there trying to do it, but to get to the mainstream, it is difficult. So that's why I asked that question, because it was a good question. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I know there's a lot of questions in the queue, and I apologize to everybody for not being able to get to all of them. But Anne, you were terrific, and please follow her work and all of the work that NGO Monitor does. And the website is ngo-monitor.org.
Yes.
So,
and feel free to send an email. I'm happy to answer questions if people have any specific questions.
Well, thank you.
Contact me through our website.
Yeah. Thank you a million for your time today, Anne, and for all you're doing. And thank you to everyone who watched, and we will see you all next week. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Lori.
Bye-bye.
Bye.